Welcome back after a wonderful lunch. And on top of all the thanks that we've given the organizers for this conference, both Tel Aviv University, Professor Stauber, and the Claims Conference, I want to thank them on behalf of all those who've eaten for the wonderful meals that they fed us with as well, and add to that also. And a lot of comments have been made about, the session after lunch, but I'm hoping this is our last day and our last two sessions so that we can go through them very successfully. A lot of thought and talk sometimes is given to something being out of the box. And in some ways, the session that we are going to today is kind of out of the box for what we've heard before, and even in some ways the theme of the conference. 70 years of Holocaust compensation and restitution, dealing with the Luxembourg Agreement, has been focused very heavily on the Claims Conference, appropriately so. The origins of the Claims Conference, the origins of the agreement, the impact on restitution in countries, Germany, Austria, and so on. We've heard many of these talks so far. This session is going to focus on the WJRO, the World Jewish Restitution Organization. So let me take just 2 minutes to give a brief background to it, as well as perhaps give a context, that overall context to our session. Our speakers may or may not address that context, but I think it's something that has been hinted at or touched on earlier in many of the earlier presentations, but I want to bring it out and speak very openly about it. So first of all, again, my name is Mark Weitzman from the World Jewish Restitution Organization. The WJRO is in many ways a sister of the Claims Conference. It was founded following the collapse of the Eastern European communist regimes, including the Baltics and the Balkans, in the mid-1990s, and it's a consortium based on 14 different Jewish organizations whose role is, and Israeli, Nachon, thank you, Colette. Colette knows more than certainly than I do, so no, I'm serious, I appreciate that. You're right. You're right. They're actually, I should say, international Jewish organizations as well, so appropriately so. And its aim is to recover property and to set up frameworks for restitution in about 18 countries outside of Germany and Austria. So the countries range alphabetically, for example, from Bosnia and Herzegovina and Bulgaria, all the way through to Slovakia, Slovenia, and Ukraine. And I will not give you the whole list of all 18, but you can imagine, and some of the countries will be the focus of presentations later on today. What I do want to say, and in terms of context, an overall context, and this was alluded to by some of the speakers of the opening event, the opening session, as well as Rachel Blumenthal in our presentation earlier, that conditions were very different, obviously, as we all know, in Eastern Europe than they were certainly in Western Europe, certainly in Germany and Austria. Many challenges existed to beginning a process of restitution after 45 years or 50 years of communist domination and rule. And these challenges included political, social, economic issues, but the one that I wanted to highlight is really the question on the challenge of dealing with restitution in the face of Holocaust distortion. Distortion, which distinct from Holocaust denial, and most of you probably are well aware of this already, does not dispute that the Holocaust happened, but it generally strives to either shift responsibility away from local collaborators or to minimize the impact of what happened, to play with the numbers, excuse what happened. It kind of shades away the reality into a different kind of political narrative, political historical narrative that is both based on some of the communist historiography of the period that lingered, as well as tapping into traditional nationalist and anti-Semitic tropes and motifs. And these efforts are particularly strong and have been in some of the countries where our work is focused and where the majority of the victims of the Nazis were found, countries like Poland and Ukraine, Lithuania, and obviously they complicate matters and make the work of restitution much more difficult. It is really hard to proceed in establishing a basis for restitution when the question of basically who did what and to who were the victims, what happened to them, what happened to their possessions, when all those facts are still in dispute. It makes it's like trying to build a building on shifting sands that you can't build on. And that is the context of dealing with many of these countries and political structures in, I'll say, Eastern Balkans of Europe, and that is makes our work in some ways significantly different from what has happened with the claims in dealing with Germany and Austria. And I think that different perspective is one that we should keep in mind. By the way, Holocaust distortion is not limited to those countries. I'm speaking coming from the United States, where we have seen Holocaust distortion from street protests all the way up to the White House in different times. So and in the Western world, we have many examples of it as well. But nonetheless, our session here is going to focus on the conditions and the successes, the challenges, perhaps even some of the failures of dealing with restitution in Eastern Europe in light of some of the conditions that I just mentioned. And I'm looking forward to the presentations that you're all going to hear very shortly. To begin with, our first presentation is Dr. Avi Weber, who is a guest lecturer at the Philipp Marburg University in Germany and at Weizmann University, and has involved in joint German-Israeli legal academic research project, Post-Holocaust Development of Legal Remedies as a Learning Process. He specializes in German European law, constitutional law, and compensation law, and since 2008, he's been the external consultant to the Ministry for Social Equality, chartered by the Israeli government to negotiate with foreign governments for restitution of property and Jewish rights. As of August 2020, he's a member of the board of EVZ, a German federal fund entrusted with compensation of slave laborers and Holocaust remembrance and education. That's the formal biography. I've asked each of our speakers to come up and begin their presentation by adding something that is not in the formal biography, so we get to know them a little bit better. Avi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just 1 second. I chose law because I'm a very untechnical person, so perhaps, Adi will come and assist me. In the meanwhile, I'll try to follow Mark's advice or request. So the most significant thing that I remember of doing was about 22 years ago when we were lobbying and pushing in the parliament for a change of the law. Is that good enough? Oh, okay. Thank you. A change of the law that we're going to discuss also in today's presentation. I was just a student then, and 22 years later, I'm still a student and still involved in issues relating to Holocaust survivors, so that's either depressing or joyful. That's how it is. So my talk today is, to put it in the context of what Mark just said before, these are the legal developments in principle and their effects on recognizing rights of survivors. The parallel to be drawn also to restitution of property is, of course, the changing of the regimes in Central Europe. And what I'm going to speak about today is more of the individual compensation rights of the survivors. But, of course, when we'll have the panel at the end, we can draw the conclusions that are the same, actually the same terms that brought to the changes for the individual compensation that could be drawn also for the property rights. So I'd like to start first from a personal dimension. The story that we're going to talk about today is the recognition of survivors from Eastern Europe and the changes of the understanding of the term Holocaust survivor. So I chose to take the personal story of my grandfather, who started long before the war as a citizen of Romania in the city of Czernowitz, who's today Ukraine's. And basically his story was that he was living there for a very long while until about the war, and then they moved to a very international city called Timișoara in Romania. It was a city that one could hide very well in because it was a multinational city where people spoke German, Hungarian, Romanian, and other languages. And there are Jews that were predominantly of German backgrounds could live well, and they thought far enough or far away from the Germans. As we all know, that paradigm didn't really materialize, and towards the end of the war, even that territory was surrounded, or German forces were at the midst of entering the area. So what I would try to do today is give a context of the topic that we're having the conference about. So the Luxembourg Agreement that we've heard a lot about in the last few days was the first international agreement actually allocating personal compensation to people. It was a breakthrough in the entire concept of international law. It was an agreement between states and the NGO, the Claims Conference, and it created for the first time basically an understanding that individuals are also subjects, in a way, of international law. So for the persecution and for deprivation of civil rights of the survivors, an agreement would be reached in order to create for them a mechanism that will reflect the moral obligation of then federal government Germany, what we know as the West Germany, that was based upon the crimes of the Nazis. The legislation, of course, is based on an American U.S. Marshal legislation that was enacted before the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany. But the BEGIS was in principle, the Bundesentschädigungsgesetz was in principle the first format of actually rendering rights for individual victims, starting from their personal situation and their properties and their monetary issues and so on and so forth. The legislation itself was limited to the territory under which people were persecuted. So the first wording of the legislation, or the first versions of the legislation, was addressing only areas that were directly under the influence of Germany, which met the historical paradigms and understanding of the Germans in the 50s as per their responsibility towards the Holocaust. And that, of course, changed en route as the legislation was developed for recognition of their moral responsibility, not only for territories directly under the German occupation and German hands, but also territories that were influenced by Nazi Germany, and so to speak, in the satellite cities and countries such as Bulgaria, Romania, and others. Surprisingly enough, although this topic was already addressed in the 60s, in modern waves of legislation, when we've met with the so-called the ghetto pension law and the follow-up directive, the first version of the legislation once again went to the original paradigms of the territorial scope of definition of survivors, meaning that the first versions of the legislation covered territories that were directly under the German occupation. In Germany, compensation law that started or were kicked off with the Luxembourg Agreement started off with what we call administrative law compensation. This was state-managed programs that were dealing directly with survivors, and these programs would run until the 70s. The German legislation had also international effects. In Israel, a copy law or follow-up law named the Law for the Invalids of Nazi Persecution, what we call here in Israel Chok Nechei Redifot HaNazim, was also legislated in Knesset. And that legislation had a special clause referring to German jurisprudence as per the definition of survivors. There were many obstacles relating to framing and allowing people from East Europe to receive their pension, as there was, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, some sort of a historical complex of actually understanding and scoping out to the amount and the way people were persecuted then. The fall of Soviet Union has, and the expansion of the European Union and NATO opened archives and enabled further research and further addressing of the situation in these territories. Another very important issue, the historical ban on compensation to East Bloc was lifted, and with that, individuals had, for the first time, the right to come up with their legal claims against the federal government as per the right to be compensated as Holocaust survivors. The very clear, under Soviet Union, anti-fascist definitions that basically neglected or told a different story of the Holocaust were also eradicated, and thus the combination of a changing of the historical research with the establishment of new frameworks allowing the recognition of rights of survivors, spearheaded by the Article 2 of the Claims Conference, that was actually a part of the reunification contract in Germany. It's allowed survivors of East Europe origins to come up with their claims. I spoke before about this legislation that I started my work with. The contract or the treaty, the Luxembourg Agreement, spoke of a cutoff date, the very specific date, October 1st, 1953, that basically spoke about the different limitations of the different groups of people to be handled by different laws. This was a clause allowing the Germans and the Israelis to discuss about a cut-off date, and after that date, basically, the responsibility remained with the federal government of Germany, and up until that date, the Israeli side had to take care of basically all those who came to Israel until that age or date. The cut-off date also played a very important role in clarifying legal definitions of Holocaust survivors, whereas the Israeli legislation has remained almost from its first day open to claims. The federal government had its legislation and its cut-off dates in the form of the German BEG Schlossgesetz that basically in end of 1969 blocked or basically had set up a date for the claims. So whereas the German legislation as of the 70s remained frozen in a way because no new claims could be brought before the administrative system, the Israeli system remained open and so was affected by the ongoing legal order in Israel and the new legal definitions in Israel that were made by the Supreme Court. The main issue about East European survivors is those who came to Israel came after this date. And thus, whether they were left in their origin countries and were excluded because they were in Soviet territories, or whether they were already technically in Israel in the 70s and the 80s, they could not make their claims because they were bound by technicalities. The collapse of Soviet Union, just to bring us to up-to-date situation, has brought many claims to be resolved. None of them, by the way, are relating only to Jewish Holocaust survivors. Most of us usually think about this context about the Jewish survivors, but here we see the wave that has brought to the EVZ, which is the slave labor fund, that was supposed to cover the slave laborers, and then the creations of new lists and new understandings according to the research, allowing allocation of funds to survivors coming from the East Bloc. The ghetto pension law that I mentioned before, again, was dealing with the territorial scope of the German influence, which was moved later and changed to Eastern territories until the legislation itself was fully changed and adopted. So we're basically standing with the question, with the change of the legislation and with the abilities of new claims to be submitted, key terms that were already thought to be covered in the 60s under the existing legislation framework were rediscussed. So basically we saw the change from the old classical understanding of ghettos, such as Ghetto Lodz, to remember from Schindler's List, to the situation of open ghettos that we know today. We've seen the change in recognitions of survivors that were only under direct Nazi persecutions to survivors that came also from the satellite countries, as I said before, Romania and Bulgaria. We see the recognition of other groups that are less relevant for this topic, but still interesting, of the North Africans. By the way, it's a very tragic case that those from those countries who actually made their way to Europe and actually suffered in camps such as Bergen-Belsen and so on were always excluded of the right to receive personal compensations because they were of wrong nationalities. So just for example, the case of people from North Africa that came to Bergen-Belsen were excluded because they were British nationals. And again, of course, parallel to the legal development, this research and the studies of what has happened in Eastern and Central Europe was always instrumental to claims that were brought before courts in Germany as per the rights of the survivors. The main changes that took place are, of course, was the enlargement east. We had a democratization process of Central and Eastern European countries, which allowed a new type of discussion with governments and their understanding of their responsibility towards what has happened. We've seen a wave also of states making their own historical committees and their own soul searching on what has happened in the Holocaust. So we know the famous Romanian case where Elie Wiesel was heading the historical committee. But we do see at the same time legislation that is ongoing, just showing us how this issue is still relevant, as we've just seen in Belarus before the fights or war started with Ukraine, where nations still pass laws relating to definitions of Nazi wrongdoing in order to make some sort of a political claim. The big change was the move from the paradigms of the 50s, as I said before, the understanding that the classical understanding of persecution and the scope of the Holocaust and the types of the Holocaust was readdressed, and we saw a wave of positivistic approach towards the research of Nazi persecution, which allowed to make the claim to enlarge the definition of survivors. We've seen also a wave of recognition of local governments outside of the territories of Germany in rights of survivors. So we've seen legislation in countries such as Poland, Romania, and others creating frameworks either for social support of Holocaust survivors or actually compensation program. In Israel, we've seen a change also in the understanding of the role of the State of Israel and its responsibility towards Holocaust survivor, a question that is, in my eyes at least, could be a topic for an entire seminar or a discussion day as per the scope of the obligation or the need of the Israeli government to take care of survivors living in Israel. But the Supreme Court has made a 180% change in its paradigms, leaving the 70s where it would only follow and copy German decisions to having its own independent Israeli free jurisprudence as per the definition of survivors. We've seen also a wave of changes of legislation also here. We had the first big decision about jumping out of this classical cutoff date of the 1st of October 1953 in Israel already in 2007, when we had the first Holocaust survivors benefit laws. Those of you who lived in Israel remember the demonstrations then led by survivors and having the Prime Minister Olmert sitting with his staff and not understanding how come there are suddenly thousands of survivors in the street blockading the Prime Minister's office. Sadly, it didn't happen as fast as we all hoped, but I think we were all very happy to see that under the government, where I think Yair Lapid was then the finance minister, that there was a change made in order to create some sort of a system that created same benefits to all survivors under Israeli law. As I said, the ongoing discussion and the ongoing changes within the historical understanding of the scope of the Holocaust and its different forms allowed survivors to push for enlarging the scope of the so-called ghetto list. Those are the places in which, under German legislation, people are to receive their payments. And there again, the Article 2 agreement of the Jewish Claims Conference played an important role in setting up rights of survivors worldwide. So I would try to come now to conclusions. So surprisingly enough, and I remember we have with us Coletta Vital that had many meetings or many discussions in her capacity as a head of a committee in the Knesset, and years after, the term Holocaust survivor is still not defined by until today. So I think we've covered most of them. We're coming to the point that we have actually worked out the legal definitions, but it is a very dynamic process that started in 1951 with the assumption of responsibility by Konrad Adenauer, and is actually ongoing until today. And we have these yearly meetings between the Claims Conference and the federal government as per pushing and recognizing new groups of survivors on a yearly basis. The dynamics of the historical research and the widening of the territorial scope also changed the understanding of the definition of survivors and allowed more countries and more groups to be included. Again, in my eyes, one of the most important things is that the sanctions towards payments to East Europe and opening up the abilities of Jews living in Central and Eastern European countries to physically or technically press their claims against the federal government allowed this ongoing discussion that once again made it clear and apparent that more groups should be done. I started off actually my talk today about the fact that I'm 22 years involved in this. So recently, just to show you how things come back over again and the history seems to repeat itself, this year we've also seen a small issue regarding sanctions. Because of the sanctioning of Russian banks, those survivors living in Russia were actually left with no money. So then again, the Jewish Claims Conference found itself maybe 70 years after the first agreement, negotiating with German government and others of means of getting food for first, support, but also money to territories that were under the embargo and the sanctions of world banks. So everything that we speak about kind of repeats itself. We're always in a way of a loop. But when we look 70 years back, I think that we've had over the years a very interesting process of the redefinition and the re-understanding of the scope of Holocaust survivors. Thank you very much.